I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
I am your mistress of ceremonies tonight. My name is Dr. Casarae L. Gibson. I am an assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies here at Syracuse University. And before I introduce our dynamic panel for tonight, I would like to read some announcements for the Department of African American Studies and our artistic unit, Community Folk Arts Center, as well as our Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. So the Department of African American Studies annual award ceremony takes place Wednesday, May 1st at 5 p.m., held in Sims Hall, room 219. We also, and you all have received flyers, so make sure that you come to our events. And you also have received an evaluation form, so please fill out that form at the end of tonight and give it to one of our graduate students located outside, Courtney or Muhammad. Okay? So the Department of African American Studies, in conjunction with the Department of Music and Art Histories, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Syracuse University Libraries, the Humanities Corridor of Central New York, and the Digital Humanities Faculty Working Group presents the Digital Humanities Research Symposium, which takes place Wednesday, April 24th, 2019 from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. in the Hall of Languages, room 500. So that concludes the announcements for the Department of African American Studies, where Dr. Herbert Ruffin II is chair. The Community Folk Arts Center invites all to attend the MFA exhibition presented by Syracuse University students, going on right now until May the 11th. The opening reception takes place April the 18th from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. CFAC also presents the 47th annual teenage competitive art exhibition, June 1st through June 15th. The closing reception will take place June 15th from 1 to 4 p.m. Dr. Tanisha Jackson is the executive director for the Community Folk Arts Center. And lastly, the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library, in partner with Humanities New York, presents The Soul of Nation, selected readings on perseverance and community. This April 17th will feature selections from Ralph Ellison's Tell It Like It Is, Baby. So that concludes all of our announcements. Now, it is my pleasure to present our featured panelists. Dr. Dana A. Williams, if you can stand and raise your hand. She is the professor of African American Literature and chair of the Department of English at Howard University, as well as interim dean of graduate education. Dr. Williams is an expert in African American literature and culture. She has published several edited volumes, including August Wilson and Black Aesthetics, Palgrave Macmillan, with Dr. Sandra G. Shannon. African American Humor, Irony, and Satire, Ishmael Reed, Satirically Speaking, Cambridge Scholars, Conversations with Leon Forrest, University Press of Mississippi, and Contemporary African American Fiction, New Critical Essays, Ohio State University Press. In addition to her edited volumes, Dr. Williams is author of a full-length study on Leon Forrest titled In the Light of Likeness, Transformed, The Literary Art of Leon Forrest, Ohio State University Press. Dr. Williams has published in numerous scholarly journals, including African American Review, CLA Journal, and Langston Hughes Review, among many. Beyond her scholarship, Dr. Williams has served as president of the Association of the Departments of English Executive Committee, chair of the Black American Literature and Culture Forum for the Modern Language Association, and past president of the College Language Association, founded in 1937, is the oldest and well-known prestigious organization for scholars of color that teach languages and literatures. Dr. Dana A. Williams. Dr. Jared A. Ball is research professor at the Institute for Urban Research, as well as professor of communication studies at Morgan State University. Dr. Ball is the author of I Mix What I Like, a mixtape manifesto, AK Press. In addition, he is the co-author of A Lie of Reinvention, Correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X with Dr. Todd S. Burrows, Black Classic Press. Dr. Ball's book chapters on politics and culture can be found in Not Our President, New Directions from the Pushed Out, The Others, and The Clear Majority in Trump's Stolen America, Third World Press, and in Democratic Destiny and the District of Columbia, Federal Politics and Public Policy, edited by Ronald Walters and Tony Michelle Travis, Lexington Books. Dr. Ball's scholarly essays appear in the Black Scholar, the Global Journal of Hip Hop Culture, and International Journal of Communication, among others. Beyond Dr. Ball's scholarly endeavors, he is the founder and editor of the multimedia podcast IMixWhatILike.org, opinion writer and columnist for Atlanta Black Star, and founder and former producer of Free Mix Radio, the original mixtape radio that ran from 2002 to 2010. Lastly, Dr. Ball is the producer and host of the Super Funky Soul Power Hour, airing Fridays from 11 in the morning to 12 noon on Washington, D.C.'s WPFW 89.3 FM Pacifica Radio. Dr. Jared A. Ball. Dr. Carol E. Henderson is Vice President for Diversity and Professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Delaware. Dr. Henderson is a scholar of African American literature and culture, particularly women's literature, cultural criticism, body and image, and visual and film culture. She is the author of Scarring the Black Body, Race and Representation in African American Literature, University of Missouri Press, and America and the Black Body, Identity Politics in Print and Visual Culture, Fairleigh Dickinson University Press. Dr. Henderson is the editor of Imagining the Black Female Body, Reconciling Image in Print and Visual Culture, Palgrave Macmillan. James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, Historical and Critical Essays, Peter Lang Publishers, and guest editor of the Mellis Multi-Ethnic Literatures of the United States special issue, The Bodies of Black Folk, as well as guest editor for the Mawa Review for the special issue, James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, Reflections 50 Years Later. Dr. Henderson has published in several scholarly journals, including CLA Journal, Modern Language Studies, and Black Camera, an international film journal, among many. In addition to her scholarly endeavors, she has served as chair of the Department of Black American Studies in various roles, including associate director and director of undergraduate studies at the University of Delaware. Dr. Carol E. Henderson. So without further ado, we are going to begin our conversation celebrating the 50th anniversary of Black Studies. So this is very important because Black Studies was founded in 1969. A coalition of students, faculty, staff, community activists came together to make sure that there were Black Studies as well as ethnic studies programs on university and college campuses worldwide. And so we know San Francisco State College or San Francisco State University was one of the early Black Studies programs. But here at Syracuse University, we cannot forget that we have our own Department of African American Studies, where students as well as faculty, staff, and community members came together to make this all possible. So our panel today is going to have a discussion, a conversation with you all about Black Studies, what it was, what it is now, and what it should be. So if Dr. Williams can come up to present.
afternoon again. So good to see so many of you here. My title is If It's Everything, It's Nothing. The Ongoing Crisis and Challenge of Black Studies as a Discipline. And I'll talk a little bit about where that title came from. In a 2011 essay titled Bourgeois Fugue, Notes on the Life of the Negro Intellectual, Houston A. Baker stoked the fires of the post-race discourse that emerged following the election of President Barack Obama. Having long ago shed the skin of a Western aesthetic valuation and having made significant contributions to African American cultural theory, Baker lamented the, quote, self-styled, raceless, and post-soul aesthetic, end quote, that consumes the more bourgeois segments of Black intellectual life, and contended that the best thing that could happen now would be, quote, the birth of a real and caring Black bourgeoisie, one E. Franklin Frazier would approve of, and that Howard University, both men's alma mater and mine, would salute as a model for a bold and vigorous African and African diaspora curriculum, end quote. In Betrayal, How Black Intellectuals Have Abandoned the Ideals of the Civil Rights Movement, Baker had already walked us through the way institutionalized Black studies programs, often aligned with the corporate power elites who use the academy for their purposes, enable the production of entrepreneurial-minded careerists and academic individualists. Notably, my generation, and I could argue the generation that precedes and follows mine, has yet to do the self-critical work of considering our own acts of betrayal. Our failure to be as attentive as we needed to be to lessons of the past, most recently, the Black Arts Movement, arguably the movement that made the professionalization of Black literary studies possible. And I'll talk a little bit about the Black Arts Movement just as a representative period, but the longer idea that I don't want to lose sight of is the long view genealogy of African intellectual thought. But because the Black Arts Movement is the closest to us and one that's instructive in its own ways, I focus there today. In many ways, we jumped into the Black Studies disciplinary wars, double Dutch, without first watching and rocking to find the rhythm. So those of you who double Dutch, you know it goes like this, and you gotta like do like this, do like this, do like this before you get in. Otherwise you get in and you mess the whole thing up and everybody's like, oh. So you gotta find the rhythm first. So a lot of us, I would say, and I'm counting myself as a part of that, jumped into this without, as I say, watching and rocking to find the rhythm. For too many, Black Studies was often conflated with the study of Black stuff. But as Howard Ramsey remarked a few days ago after I briefed him on an exchange about disciplinarity, methodology, and theory that happened during a question and answer session at a Black Arts or a Black Studies panel at the College Language Association, if it's everything, it's nothing. Taking Baker's challenge as outlined in the book, and then again in the article very seriously, I began to think very deliberately about the myriad ways my colleagues and I had yet to build that model. One of the reasons I had returned to Howard as a faculty member in 2003, completely unfazed at the two frequent comments from many of my peers at LSU and Baton Rouge that my choice was sentimental and it was a career-ending move. One of the reasons I returned, in fact, though, was because I too, like Baker, believed that such a model was possible, that it was necessary, and that it was most likely to emerge as a purposeful intellectual and cultural enterprise at Howard. My belief was not undergirded in mere hope and speculation. There was an indisputable legacy as proof and intermittent contemporary efforts as evidence, including Nathan Hare's leaving Howard to go to San Francisco State. But the reality is that not even Howard has managed to free itself from the disciplinary loyalties and ideological affinities that limit serious engagement with African ways of knowing and being in ways that enliven humanity, or even the study of the humanities, my field. Adherence to the discipline and attending methodologies and to ideologies that tend to inform the traditional Western academy, in short, trouble the waters that might birth the kind of curriculum Baker calls for. Not yet ready to concede defeat, however, the question I ask myself repeatedly echoes the question W.B. Du Bois posed in Whither, Now, and Why, an address he gave at Johnson C. Smith. He writes, quote, "Are we to assume that we will simply adopt the ideals of Americans and become what they are or what they want to be, and that we will have, in this process, no ideals of our own after the American achieves, or the African American, or the Negro, as he calls him, achieves full American citizenship?" The question that I ask is, now that the world is turning more toward a global reality, where does Africana Studies, as a discipline committed to the cause of liberation at home and throughout the diaspora, go from here? No less important, though, are the questions, how do we get there, and why does going there matter? To be clear, my own disciplinary training is in literature. The content I study is African American literature writ large, fiction since 1970 in particular. This means that for years, except for the work I did intuitively, my theoretical and methodological approach to this literature was based in English studies or the humanities. In its broadest interpretation, the humanities concerns itself foremost with the exploration, analysis, and exchange of ideas that inform the human experience and its condition. It derives, of course, from the late 14th and early 15th century Italian and English Renaissance traditions of humanists to describe the intellectual pursuits of those who emphasize the primacy of classical literature and grammar and rhetoric and history and philosophy in formal education systems. As the study of humanities disciplines expanded in time and space, it claimed to inspire a global, cultural dialogue. Yet, its essential motivation undeniably has been the study of languages, literatures, and cultures of the ancient Mediterranean world, notably to the exclusion of the world that predates it. And it's important to think about how that moment predates it, because there's one of the things that I tend to do in the Intro to Humanities classes that I teach, for instance, is oriented around this notion that John Henrik Clarke articulates any number of places, but most clearly in the African World History Project, the preliminary challenge. He writes, when Europe was born, Africa, particularly Egypt, had had a 10,000-year walk in the sun, politically and culturally, and was now tired from its long journey. The challenge of the Nile Valley created Egypt. The challenge of Egypt created the Mediterranean islands and influenced Rome and Greece, and the challenge of Rome and Greece clearly influenced Europe. To master content and to build a bridge for a single continent and its civilizations is perhaps unreasonable, still, for a department, though theoretically this is what some African studies departments claim to do, or at least claim to aim to do, but their subject positioning as a construct of the Western Academy makes it similarly impossible. And you probably already know the story of the Ford Foundation's influence on the development of African studies departments, similarly with African American studies departments. The primary argument here, though, is that the epistemology doesn't depart enough from the Western Academy in terms of an institutionalized form to do the work that it sets out to do. The disciplinary and methodological affinities are too strong and too limited, and the implications, in my estimation, are too dangerous. One hope, then, might be to turn to a Black Studies program, which is the only academic discipline that emerges out of the community and thereby has commitments both within and beyond the university. But Black Studies has yet to fortify its methodology, though it has made great strides in doing so around the country and at Howard especially, in ways that enable the discipline to rise and meet the challenge before us. In important ways, Howard's Afro-American Studies department is without peer. And by that I mean it has 5 faculty with PhDs in African American Studies, not in disparate fields, doing, quote unquote, as they say in some instances, the work of the disciplinary affinities that they come out of. Howard also offers courses in Medu Neter, or Egyptian hieroglyphs, every semester. The challenge of language study is really at the heart of the issue for some. As Mukomo wa Ngugi, who is Ngugi wa Thiong'o's son, argues in Decolonizing the Mind, What It Means Today, the failure in African language study tightens, quote, the bond to the English metaphysical empire, end quote. As was the case with the elder Ngugi, for us, practicing the politics of language will come at a personal price, but the reward can be great. I agree with Mukoma here when he writes, our imaginations draw from our creolized cultures, and our cultures have had their own approaches to aesthetics. This is a point Clyde Taylor makes in Mask of Art. We simply must have the courage to break the aesthetic contract. Negotiating the contract is a fool's errand. Western aesthetic systems, Taylor argues, have inherent biases, and aesthetic reasoning relies on a universal valuing subject that is based on a pre-existing theory of knowledge. That theory of knowledge is never universal, though it claims to be. Rather, it's based on the biases of the society that produces it. But not all cultures have hierarchies of value, so we know it is possible to avoid a universalizing standard. The task of reclaiming and reconstructing that kind of aesthetic system is ours. To return to the Black Arts Movement as our most recent instructive period, Taylor's argument is that the Black Arts Movement does the important work of interrogating the foundations of a universal standard, but does not do this fully before folding into itself. In other words, the Black Arts Movement unravels the knot through revealing the falsity of Western aesthetics as normal or natural, but then it refuses to drop the chain altogether. The vision and commitment to building a team of scholars who will finally enable us to allow Black peoples on the continent and throughout the diaspora to be in conversation with ourselves with little regard for the white gaze are real. The vision and commitment were similarly made possible by student protests, as was the case here first, and subsequently by conferences and summits and symposium by students and their faculty, which called for a total rejection of university-sanctioned, if not mandated, acculturation to a society that debilitates Black people. So why nearly 50 years after the historic conferences and the historic emergence of Black Studies programs do we still await a response to a call to develop the mechanics necessary to have Blackness inform an understanding of universal experiences and to recognize that no history of the world can be understood without full appreciation of the history of Africa, especially as it relates to the development of mankind through the ages? And to be clear again, I'm not exempting Howard in this moment either, because there are these challenges across campuses and across programs. The tendency as faculty is to obfuscate the challenge of first determining and then articulating and executing the structure and mechanics with a need for administrative cooperation. So that's our claim often. We need the administration to cooperate. We must acknowledge the administrative impediments that distract us from the work we've been called to do as the scapegoats that impediments can be and often are. To be clear, I do not exempt myself again from the critique. I am willing, however, to continue to encourage us to resist the silence scholars who keep trying to push us on the question of disciplinarity are too often met with. Greg Carr's What Black Studies Is Not, Moving from Crisis to Liberation in Africana Intellectual Work, for example, continues to be met with one of two responses: silence or defensive contempt. While pre-academic professionalized Black studies was not conceived at its inception as a safety valve for the traditional form of American democracy, increasingly, he argues, quote, the field and idea of Africana studies is reduced and expanded to a subject matter field, rather than a field of disciplinary contestation, and the generation of normative theoretical space. This raises the unavoidable question: is our intellectual work in the field being put to its best uses? Are we asking the right questions, or even the same questions our ancestors and those not oriented with our privileged elite class status asked? Are our contemporary questions still deeply relevant? And as the environmental and experiential conditions that cause us to ask our initial human questions continue to exist, has the circumstance that interrupted and tethered the arc of human inquiry to the problematic of survival so altered it that liberation as a collective practice is no longer conceivable? End quote. In that article, he continues to talk about the American state of mind and how, or the American state rather, that how it had from its inception a pushback against the full measure of African life on its own terms. Quote, this racist posture characterized by Michael Gomez as the rejection of Africa as equal set the stage for what Cedric Robinson described as two alternative Black political cultures. The first, a set of elite cultural practices, orients Blacks' aspirations for liberation toward the pursuit of the rights and privileges jealously guarded by whites. The second, emerging from the lives of plantation laborers, reflects a maroon sensibility and forms what Robinson calls a creative rather than an imitative, democratic rather than Republican, Afro-Christian rather than secular, and materialist political culture. The two strains converge at moments of mutual interest, but those moments increasingly are defined by elite interests, end quote. And of course, the conversation is a little more complicated now when we bring into the conversation ideas like Fred Moten's Undercommons, where you're seeing things happening in academic spaces that are community-based, but that are also pushing towards methodology and theory as well. Indeed, Black Studies at its inception was tasked with the work of moving beyond corrective measures and pivots towards inclusion as a discipline, and instead, as Josh Myers has argued, moving toward a more robust critique of Western civilization and the very grounding assumptions that guide how disciplines approach reality. While scholars show some awareness of just how recent realities related to what we are calling this neo-fascist moment, how it mirrors those that preceded, very few deliberately consider the ways these long-view genealogies might provide us with some solutions. The Black Arts Movement, again, here is useful to talk about, particularly in terms of its efforts and ability to offer meaningful responses to renewed social, political, and economic upheavals. This is a very recent example of what we can learn from preceding attempts to articulate methodology and theory. Retrospectives of the Black Arts Movement, especially in relation to interrogations of the current period, provide ample opportunity to draw on that movement's usable past, since the culture wars, broadly conceived and all-encompassing, never really dissipated. Rather, they simply shape-shifted. Even though there were writers and cultural activists who picked up the baton of the cultural struggles of the 60s, adjusting to original practices or inventing new ones, absent the rhetorical style of the 1960s, Clyde Taylor argues, the receiving runners somehow were no longer recognizable as the next leg of an ongoing relay race. So the idea here again is that there's this separation between movements, and once a movement quote unquote ends, we don't really focus on what's usable. We have to develop the habit of recognizing both the conceptual and the theoretical continuity and transformations of any liberatory impulse. If Taylor is to be believed, there are concepts freshly minted in the Black Power movement of the 1960s that still hold value and that may need to be defended. To be clear, those concepts that should be discarded must be. I'm thinking especially of BAM's, the Black Arts Movement's homophobia and the privileging of male voices. And as Eleanor Traylor has argued, the era's limitations and the failures of the Black Arts Movement, its many-sided, multi-voice, social and self-critical project, are as crucial to the process of self-liberation as are its achievements. We can learn as much from their failures as we can from their successes. Indeed, the transferring of aesthetic and theoretical values from one moment to the next, from one movement to the next, can only enrich the ways we respond to that all-important inquiry Black arts poet Sonia Sanchez uttered years ago. But how do it free us? To think about the pre-academic writers and what they might teach us about this moment that we are in, how they might have even predicted it, we would do well to consider some of the major fiction writers. And it's not just because I work in fiction that I'm thinking about this, right? So most people who think about the Black Arts Movement are thinking about the poetry and the plays, in part because the poetry was easily accessible. You could print it, you could duplicate it, and similarly with the plays, you could put the performance on, it could be open to the community, it was highly accessible. The fiction got short shrift in many instances for a couple of reasons, not just because it was longer and revolution was real and people didn't have time to sit down and read a 300-page novel. But scholars haven't engaged it, in my estimation, as a literature scholar. I can say this. When I think about teaching that particular period, when I had to go through the list of the writers that I would think about, it was tougher to come up with than not. Part of what I'm looking at now is to saying how responsible, or is, to try to essentially mitigate and I hope you understand that I'm using this fairly loosely. My act of betrayal, if you will, with my own scholarship was to go and pay close attention to those writers in the 60s, and I'll name just a couple of them. 60s and 70s, John Oliver Killens, and Then We Heard the Thunder, Sippy, Slaves, The Cotillion, Rosa Gee's Bird at My Window, Sarah Wright's This Child's Gonna Live, John A. Williams' The Man Who Cried I Am, William Melvin Kelly's A Drop of Patience, and so on. John Edgar Wideman, I could go on, but when you think about that period, we think less about those fiction writers than we should. Its conspicuous association with the Black Arts Movement notwithstanding, fiction played a significant role in what Mel Watkins in 1969 called a revolution in Black books. If Black writers expressing themselves freely are accepted, he wrote, they will contribute to the advancement of Afro-Americans and in the process, more than likely broaden significantly the world of literature. If they are not, the gap between the races in literature and in the streets will only widen. In the Black Arts Movement and its critics, David Lionel Smith notes, and I'll close with this, when we think of the Black Arts Movement, its polemics, its excesses, what they are, what we often remember, perhaps it is time to consider the substantive achievements of the movement. Perhaps they are significant, enduring, and more influential than we commonly acknowledge. It is certain, in any case, that this movement poses a great opportunity and challenge for literary cultural historians. And I would add here, for African American Studies scholars who are working on this question of theory, methodology, and discipline. Though understanding this particular movement and its place in our national history and movements that precede it as in terms of our immediate issue, meeting the scholarly challenge of long view genealogy may well lead us to create new ways of understanding our collective past. If we do, our view of the present cannot stand unaltered. Thank you for your
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. If we were like in a community setting or nothing was expected of me, I would literally, and I'm not just saying this, I would literally just say ditto and sit down. Dr. Williams and I had not met before today, but I'm struck by the similarity in what I at least see as our presentations, and I assure you it was not on purpose. But literally, I could just say ditto and sit down. I think I fully agree. That was fantastic. What I do want to say just very quickly, since this is somewhat related to Dr. King, I can't help but say that for a long time I've been, part of a group of people, not necessarily working together consciously, who have been trying to unearth the real Dr. King as he actually was. And much of what we think is of him is a really commercial, state-sponsored counterintelligence program result of an image that has nothing to do with the man himself. And I often make the comment that he's the least understood person in human history, second only maybe to Jesus Christ. Anyway, but we'll move on from that. So one, I just again want to thank everybody for putting this together, for all of you for coming and for my invitation. I think these conversations are essential, and as someone who came through the Africana Studies and Research Center as a graduate student right down the road in Cornell some years ago, and having seen, and I'll come back to in just a moment, what has happened to that institution, this conversation is extremely important. In his discussion of the difference between Africana critical theory and Africana philosophy, Ryland Rabaka defines a fracture similar to that which exists today between criticism of mass media journalism practice and what this paper attempts to define as Black radical media criticism or Africana media criticism. Just as Rabaka distinguishes Africana philosophy as being, quote, concerned only with identifying, reconstructing, and creating traditions and repositories for thought of continental and diasporan Africans, and Africana critical theory as theory critical of domination and discrimination in continental and diasporan African life, worlds, and lived experiences, so too does my attempt at a Black radical media criticism or an Africana media criticism seek to draw these distinctions between itself and existing media criticism. That is, while there exists no shortage of media criticism or analysis stemming from the African or Black world, and of course European or white media criticism, including what is often described as radical media criticism, there exists in each tradition a tendency to either recount African Black work in a manner reminiscent of establishing repositories, or to simply, in the case of most Eurocentric scholarship, filter African world thought through their own lens, if not omitting such perspectives altogether. Black radical media criticism or Africana media criticism attempts in a distinct fashion to organize various traditions of African world thought, apply them specifically to a criticism of mass media and journalistic practice, so as to have them become, as Rabaka continues, of Africana critical theory, critiques not simply of imperialism, but the anti-imperial theory and practice of the past to better confront, contradict, and correct domination in the present and offer alternatives for liberation in the future, end quote. I started with this intro to work I've never completed, A, because it's just sitting and collecting dust on my cloud, and B, it still situates my relationship to Black or Africana studies and what I see as a remaining or lingering political problem within that and really all academic fields. As John Henry Clarke has said, just to bring his name back up, he was actually the subject of my master's thesis, quote, history is a clock that people use to tell their political time of day, their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells a people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. Most important, history tells a people where they still must go, what they still must be. The relationship of history to a people is the same as that of a mother to her child. And then lastly, he would also say something to the effect that any worthy education is meant to teach people to be responsible handlers of power. And because I've just come back from a commemoration of one of Clarke's proteges, Dr. James Turner, just this past weekend, I'd like for something he said about Africana Studies some years ago to be included as a grounding for my own thoughts and contribution to this discussion. Turner wrote, "To achieve an expansive model in Black studies, the purpose of history must be for higher intellectual exposition than recording and describing the facts of events. Evidentiary statements and historical documentation must give more than a chronicle and should present instead an interpretation that penetrates the social meaning in human terms of the important stages in the movements of history. As a methodology, history in Black studies constitutes the foundation for theoretical construction of an analysis of the fundamental relationship between the political economy and societal developments and the racial divisions of labor and privilege and the common patterns of life chances peculiar to the social conditions of Black people. Basic to the teleology of Africana Studies is the application of knowledge to promote social change, end quote. Given as I would argue, and I don't think it really takes that much to demonstrate, nearly all the material indicators that we would use to assess the condition of any group of people when applied to the conditions of Black people in the United States, it's very clear that we still need revolutionary movements. And yet the absence of such movements has left a void in what produced Black studies initially and what propelled many of the foundational scholars to do the work that they did, and what we need more of today, a consciously engaged intellectual wing of our liberation struggle. In fact, one reason the master's degree I earned while at the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University was an MPS as opposed to an MA, that is a Master of Professional Studies, was because of the explicit call that Dr. Turner and other founders had that Black studies would have a direct professional, practical application with those in the community. It was meant explicitly from the start not to be a distinct intellectual enterprise within the ivory towers of higher education, but specifically, as I mentioned, the intellectual wing to the on-the-ground Black liberation struggle. And what I see playing as a role in disconnecting the intellectual from the political is both a moment of Black liberation denouement, crushed under the weight of the most sophisticated and powerful state in human history, with a propaganda and psychological warfare apparatus which exists largely beyond perception, making us all Marshall McLuhan's fish. Anybody ever heard of Marshall McLuhan? One of my favorite quotes from him said, "Fish did not discover water." No. Fish did not discover water. How does that line go? Oh my God, I quote it all the time and I can't get it. Fish did not discover water because water is an environment, exists beyond perception, as all environments do. And his point simply was, as the quote that I've just sort of bastardized says, is that we're born into an environment that seeks us, locates us, puts us in roles to play, symbolizes us, reproduces us in image, and encourages a certain public behavior which is supposed to manage, a certain public opinion which is supposed to manage our social behavior. But we don't know that environment exists because it's always beyond perception. So the propaganda and psychological warfare apparatus that has been constructed around us quite intentionally is part of a specific attack on higher education led by tremendous shifts in funding from humanities and social sciences to STEM-related fields, which is seen as work which is much more readily militarily applied. So as a good friend of mine, Jelani Favors, just wrote in his new book on the history of Black colleges and universities, one of the points that he raises quite explicitly is that the liberation component that was always understood as part of the curriculum in HBCU, early Black education, Black higher education, was intentionally attacked by simply redirecting funding away from social sciences and humanities into STEM-related fields, specifically because the idea remains that if you have more people focused intently on the hard sciences, they're more easily applied to the military and Defense Department funding that often accompanies these major projects that are brought to these universities. So one of the ways that there was an explicit attack on Black studies becoming or Black students becoming part of a political struggle was to just encourage a redirection away from critical consciousness and political education and just an intent and hard focus on hard sciences. So for me, much of my focus lately has been on the popular project, symbol, and myth development around Black radical histories and economic condition. For instance, our collective work in challenging the very establishment press reinvention of Malcolm X, attributed to the late Manning Marable, in which I argue that the nationalisms, socialisms, Pan-Africanisms, and engagement with armed struggle, all central to Malcolm X's life, are fully recast as at best progressive Democratic Party politics. Similarly, I raise a small voice against the protege of Manning Marable and the far more damaging Henry Louis Gates, who once referred to himself as an intellectual entrepreneur, which read differently is just, I'm willing to sell black history to the highest bidder and recast it in any way the commercial world would like me to. That is his protege, Peniel Joseph, whose claims of being, quote, the father of black power studies have seen his work on Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, or Kwame Ture, be sophisticated assaults on the revolutionary ideas with which these two men and their organized efforts worked. This once led Kwame Ture's comrade, Bob Brown, to ask of Peniel Joseph, if you are the father of black power studies, well then who's the mother? Or finally, that is a lot more funny when it happened. The point being, if you're trying to create something as a singular human being, you're doing something, in other words, by calling yourself solely the father, you're trying to take sole claim for this whole study and situate its political trajectory and interpretive lens. Anyway, so Bob, I think, rightfully said, well, where's the mother? And where's her analysis? Or finally, my routinely deployed critique of the myth of black buying power, which seeks to replace sound political economic analysis with marketing strategies meant to assist corporate America in fleecing what little money still exists in those communities. In other words, my point here, just to conclude and stay close within the time frame here, is that my point again is that our work must be connected overtly to the needs and political struggles of our communities. The work that I mentioned, that I highlighted, that I'm myself engaged in, is just a small attempt to live up and adhere to that principle by challenging the popular representation of the actual conditions in which we find ourselves and the analyses that we need to work to organize ourselves out of these conditions. And I want to be explicit about that as possible. Or as one person once said of me, I'm politically out of the closet, which I thought was pretty interesting and funny, actually. Africana Studies, excuse me, has to be remembered and it must be reminded is and has always been meant to be not only a creation of intellectual space for the study and the intellectual arm ring of the black liberation struggle, but it's also a creative space for other oppressed communities, and it has played an instrumental role in opening up intellectual space for the study of any number of other oppressed groups. Similarly, and I did want to mention this, that the work that we do with imixwhatilike.org, by the way, I Mix What I Like is not meant to be a sole individual reference. The I in that is really sort of the royal we, and it's really just an homage to Steve Biko, the great Azanian or South African revolutionary, and his work as a journalist called I Write What I Like. And because we were doing mixtapes and multimedia, the idea was I mix what I like to take that same black consciousness, radical fervor into our journalistic and media practice. And the work we do with the website has really become an online repository of world majority thought and action. A lot of the work that we do there are interviews. We record audio at panels like this. A lot of the work we do is to engage with scholars, particularly those who you don't find on MSNBC and CNN, to remind people that there is a tremendous repository of work being conducted by people who are often isolated and put into silos imposed upon them by the institutions in which we work, but whose work is of great value to people beyond the academy. So finally, the goal there is for this work is my godfather and long veteran of the civil rights and black power struggles, Tom Porter, points out. Our job in this generation is to become the negation of the negation. That is, with the early advent or the initial advent of black power, black studies, which were again meant to be the intellectual component or the intellectual wing of the black liberation struggle. There has ever since then been an attempt to negate that movement. And as I just left with the Africana Studies and Research Center again at Cornell, there has been, from their point of view, a 50-year successful process of removing the sovereignty of that center and having it put back safely, from their point of view again, in the College of Liberal Arts. The point being, the goal had been from its inception a center that had been forced upon the campus by the movements in the streets that spilled over onto the campuses, were including forcible takeovers of buildings, the Willard Straight takeover most famously at Cornell. Ever since then, where people were saying explicitly, our academic experience must reflect the needs of the struggles in the streets, there has been the intellectual equivalent of what has happened in those streets. That is, the counterintelligence program destruction of those movements was met by a similar effort within the academy. 50 years later, we see a lot of that impact. Programs lose their sovereignty, they lose their lines, they lose their funding, they lose their ability to hire who they want to hire, they lose their ability to study what they want to study. Some of us who are not specifically in Africana Studies programs but housed within HBCUs were handed from our deans and other administrators articles about teaching hospital models, where we're basically going to use the corporate model of teaching what corporations need to be taught to get rid of any form of critical thinking and consciousness. And then I'll end this way by what was said to me when I raised this issue as a concern within my own university. A very high-ranking member of the administration at the time said, and I've been, I keep bringing this back because it was such a shock in its honesty that I think it's important to note. He said, Dr. Ball, the problem you're having is that you want to create new knowledge, and we don't do that here. Your job is to create menial laborers for the communications industry, end quote. Well, our goal and our job, I think, is in the history of Black and Africana Studies, is to create new knowledge meant to support the political and social movement needs of the people in the communities that are still as oppressed today as they have ever been. And with that, I'll stop with the words of Fred Hampton by saying, to you I say peace, because I know you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody, and thank you for having me in this conversation.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
So good evening. It is, it's hard to follow those acts. So I just want to say thank you to Dr. Williams and to Dr. Ball for setting the stage for me to kind of have some fun with my presentation. It'll be theoretical, but have some fun. Thank you, Dr. Gibson, for inviting me. I decided, because I like film, to focus on Black Panther, and I'll tell you why I'm going to do that and how I'm going to connect that to our conversation today. So for me, Black Panther entering into the public discourse was about as revolutionary as Barack Obama getting into the White House. That's the way I see it, because of the conversations that followed that. The fact that people showed up in their African garb at the viewing, it became an entire community discussion. People were buying tickets for young people to go see the film. And so I want to kind of critique that moment. And the title of my talk is Degrees of Blackness, or the remix, on Black Studies, Wakanda, and Our Spiritual Strivings. And so I'm taking that from Du Bois's notion of the color line. And I start with this conversation. This year's Oscars, and I want to start with the Oscars because the Oscars to me is a prototype of the Academy, if you will, writ large. I'm thinking academic halls and its ability to set standards about what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. So this year's Oscar race for Best Film serves as a euphemism for the conversations we're having today. In the shadow of an anniversary that marks the arrival of some 20 Africans 400 years ago in Virginia, an arrival that would begin an odyssey of resilience for an entire people and bring to bear the true moral and ethical character of a nation. In the textures of the conundrum of the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter entanglements that has, as one social critic says, and it was interesting, asked, where were all lives matter between 1619 and 1968? Or, as a colleague once told me, if they had just said Black Lives Matter too, that might have disempowered those who want to make the issue about whiteness and not the violence against Black people without recompense. In a political and cultural moment that has seen poverty and gentrification increase tenfold, and efforts towards inclusion, diversity, and equity, indeed the American way, come under federal, state, local, and judiciary surveillance and regulations on our college campuses and at our country's borders. In the shadow of all of that, Hollywood presents us with degrees of blackness in the 2019 Oscar nomination list that portend the complex genealogies, indeed access points, to a discussion about what stands in as an authentic black experience vis-a-vis film, and how that interrogation likewise reflects the Americanism so embedded in these visual productions. Now, of course, Hollywood has always dabbled in, and I would even say been obsessed with, black identity politics. I dare not recall the foundational fissures that find its genesis in The Birth of a Nation, a mockery of blackness whose detrimental images in blackface continue to loom large in the American cultural imaginary in haunting and relevant ways. Nor will I speak of the legacy of Hollywood to stingily award the coveted Oscar to actors and actresses of color, and when they do, they only award it for certain roles played by actors of African ancestry. And here I'm thinking Denzel Washington for Training Day, when we knew he should have won it for Malcolm X, and Halle Berry's Monster Ball, and I won't even go into detail, just I'll leave it there. As Toni Morrison reminds us in Playing in the Dark, the Africanisms that America has created, not rooted in a greater knowledge of Africa as we know it, but in a pathogenic sort of shorthand that, and this is a quote from Morrison, through simple expedients of demonizing and reifying the range of color on a palette, made a way to both talk about and police matters of class, sexual license and repression, formations and exercises of power, and mediations on ethics and accountability. In short, by reinventing the human landscape in the American body politic to co-opt black bodies through a process of omissions, startling contradictions, and racialized discourse, blackness is coded as a signatory of non-Americanism that shores up the fragility of whiteness through subjugated imperialistic reasoning. But I digress. But I think it's important to talk about what and how America has seemed to define blackness before we can begin to talk about what Black Studies is. And I mean in that framework. What I really hope to do in the next few moments I have here to talk about how this 2019 Oscars draws into sharp view a discussion about the degrees of blackness operating in literal and literary, visual, judicial, and cultural spaces worldwide, and how Hollywood's marketing of it informs our current discussion of what constitutes Black Studies or the study of blackness in this new millennium. And I'll talk about that in new millennium in a minute. And I say this knowing full well that Hollywood has not had real conversations about Pan-Africanism, the textures of the methodological approaches to the disciplinary that shape the work, and how this work frames visual literacy in global cultures. Now I know that, but yet and still it has an impact. So what has been discussed thus far, and I think dynamically so by the Williams and Ball, are the nuances and intentionality of Black and Africana studies. And I have that "and" because depending on where and what your department is named will determine the politics of that. We know it started in a spirit of revolution and activism. It started in opposition to erasure, both physically and intellectually, from the selective, myopic hallways of the academy. It also sprang from a cultural tradition and spiritual striving to affirm and celebrate the genius of a people denied access to their own history. I must reflect here on Carter G. Woodson, the son of former slaves, who started a cultural movement and pioneered the celebration of Black history in 1926. I think we can't talk about Black studies without talking about other moments in history where this conversation began. And first, Black history started off as a day. Imagine that, talking about entire people and their history in a day. Then it became a week, and then it became the shortest month in the year, and that's February. But I look at Carter Woodson and also the work that Arthur Schomburg did, and he knew that it was not enough to set the body free. You must liberate the mind and the spirit as well. No man or woman can know where he or she is going, writes Maya Angelou, unless each knows exactly where they have been and exactly how they arrived at their present place. So if you know Schomburg's essay, The Negro Digs Up His Past, and I think it's interesting to even mention him here because of his racial and ethnic background, Puerto Rican, so there's that kind of global aspect to that. He argues, and I think if you've read it, you know that a teacher told him that there's no history. Black people don't have history, which I can't even understand how they form that. And so he set out to prove that wrong. He also argues that, and this is a quote from him, and he argues that though it is orthodox to think of America as the one country where it is unnecessary to have a past, what is a luxury for the nation as a whole becomes a prime necessity for people of African ancestry. He says Negro, but I'm going to say people of African ancestry. And so what he's arguing is we can't afford not to have history because of where we come from and what we're grounded. We can't separate that. That is what Black Studies is, but that also is the work Black Studies in and outside of specialized communities has to do for the academy and also for people writ large, and I mean the world writ large. Black Studies, it is about Black liberation holistically and in concert with community. It is a study of Black life and the impact Black life has had on world discovery. It is social justice and human rights as King, and you all know this quote well, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. It is the recovery of historical, genealogical, and cultural memory, a compass to the heart of America's racial soul, as former Attorney General Eric Holder has argued elsewhere. The interdisciplinary nature of Black Studies writ large creates opportunities for contextualizing America's complex identities within larger frameworks of world history through every discipline imaginable. After all, the Americas encompasses geographical spaces where Africa's influence is readily found, but these spaces also denote in symbolic ways the manner in which traditional ways of thinking about culture and the topography and the academy have elided the unique and distinct frameworks that acknowledge other shades of color in America's history, colors that affirm the humanity of all people who helped to shape America's identity well before and well after slavery. And the reason I bring this up is because I know when I taught African American literature, one of the things I used to tell my students is if you begin African literature or African history in slavery, then you always have a slave. If you begin the history of people of African ancestry in Africa, you have an empowered being, because that's a whole nother hundreds, quadrillions of years of operating history. And of course we know civilization was birthed in Africa. And I'm amazed that people want to talk about Egypt as if it is not in Africa. And so, yes, well before and well after slavery. So the Pan-African's lens serves as a bridge, a pathway to discuss the distinct experiences of people of African heritage in America, Africans in America, and Africans in Africa. And I want to say that because there's tension in those communities, which we can talk about at question and answer, I hope. So Black Studies has always and will continue to influence the epistemological ways of knowing and producing knowledge well into the 21st century and beyond. And it is these ways of knowing that directs me back to the Oscars. So I know y'all wondering how I was going to get back there. So I had to do all that first. This year's Oscar looks a lot different, and I know you all know the history. I'll go through it quickly. Of the whiteout of 2015 and 2016. 2016 found all 20 contenders for acting awards were white, and that films with Black themes have been shut out of the Best Picture category. That year produced Creed and Straight Outta Compton. Straight Outta Compton, that's my neck of the woods. And they were eligible to be named, word. As far as actors, Idris Elba could have been nominated for Beast of No Nation. Michael B. Jordan could have been nominated for Creed, and Will Smith for Concussion, if you remember that film. But none of them were nominated. Sylvester Stallone got the nomination nod for supporting actor in Creed, go figure. And so did the two white writers for Straight Outta Compton who were handpicked by Dre and Ice Cube. They got nomination, but no one else. And that is in the shadow of, in 2014, guess what the best film was? 12 Years a Slave. And Lupita Nyong'o, who was fabulous, won for Best Supporting Actress in 2014. But I want to bring that up because of what Hollywood's palette is for revolutionary black film. And so the 2000 nomination list looked different. Best Picture had 3 black-themed films: Black Klansman, which was directed by Spike Lee; Green Book, a remix of the Driving Miss Daisy film of 1989, for which Morgan Freeman won a Golden Globe Award for Best Actor. And yet, let me say this, because we know Green Book was really about Dr. Shirley, but for some reason the driver became the focus. So this was somebody else's film and said, yes, plus the family had issues with the depiction and untruths of that. But one of the things I will say about Green Book is that the topic of the archival Green Book and its significance in African American culture was a welcome conversation. For those who don't know what the Green Book is, you'd better ask somebody, as I would say in my neighborhood. We can have that conversation later. Black Panther was a screenplay, the other, written by Ryan Coogler and Joe Robert Cole and directed by Coogler. Black Panther, of course, is brainchild of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who are native New Yorkers, and I would argue were revolutionary in creating these characters in 1966 that were empowered characters within their limited range. While 2 actors of African ancestry won Best Supporting Oscars, Regina King for A Beale Street Could Talk, and Ali for Green Book, go figure about that one. The film is about Dr. Shirley, and I already said that, Ali, yet he is the Best Supporting Actor. Amazing. It is about him, but he is the Best Supporting Actor. And of course, the focus seems to be more on the white bouncer and driver, Tony Lip. Spike Lee won for Best Adapted Screenplay. Ruth Carter did win for Costume Design, and Hannah Beachler for Production Design, and those were connected to Black Panther, I believe. And Black Panther, and the fact that Green Book received the coveted award instead of Black Panther begs the question, and then answers it, about Hollywood and America's cultural palette for revolutionary blackness. Coogler and Cole's layering of blackness in Black Panther speaks to the multiple nuances that are evident in their study of black life. And we could talk about whether we think it's a study of blackness or if it embodies the black Africana aesthetic. Rather than dodge complicated themes about race and identity, writes journalist Jamil Smith, the film grapples head-on with the issues affecting modern-day black life. What the ultimate question becomes is Coogler doing the work of revolutionary black filmmaking in a system called the Marvel Comics franchise that has served as an American primer of America's cultural history and social systems? And I asked this question knowing that Stan Lee were New York and Jack Kirby were New York natives, but I also, and Coogler was responsible for the screenplay. He based it on that, but he created his own screenplay. And I also asked it because of the economic component to this material conversation, which is that Black Panther's box office receipts were $1.347 billion with a B. $1 billion, and where were those dollars spent? And did they come back into the community? The other question I have is, if Coogler is doing revolutionary black filmmaking, isn't he doing that in the spirit of the black arts movement, where the distinct cultural aspects and concepts of blackness are interrogated and Western popular, social, historical, judicial, and cultural representations are critiqued through art? Coogler's background is central to understanding just how multi-layered Black Panther is, and I want to take a minute here. He was born in 1986 in the millennial era in Oakland, California. His father, Ira Kugler, is a juvenile hall probation counselor, and Kugler does this work as well. His mother, Jocelyn, is a community organizer. Oakland's, California's lore is well known. The Black Panthers were rooted there. They and their whole title is the Black Panthers for Self-Defense, was founded in Oakland in 1966. Their community assistance programs, they established more than 60, provided medical services, legal aid instruction, and are focused on the well-being of Black children, serving as a predecessor to the Head Start program. The Panthers were known for protecting their community from abusive police officers and exercised their right to bear arms. The average age of the Panthers was early to mid 20s, and is known the comic Black Panther was created around that time. If you know Kugler's film history, Fruitvale Station, which looks at the last 24 hours of Oscar Grant's life, takes place in Oakland. His second film, Creed, takes the American story franchise, the Rocky franchise, and in a revolutionary artistic move of genius, adds the African American story right along with it. Now remember, Rocky is, it is like American as apple pie. And Kugler then adds the Creed story, and it's done well. One writer argues that Kugler's work centers on overlooked people and cultures. He does the act of recovering Africanist memory, or remembering in Morrison's framework through film. And if you know about remembering, this is where I'm relying on my literature background, in Beloved, Morrison argues that remember is this memory that operates by itself. It is present. It remains long after the thought has left the person or an event has happened. So when I think of Fruitvale Station, I see it kind of in that way. So I want to look at Black Panther, and if you haven't seen the film, I hope I don't spoil it for you. And if you haven't seen the film, that'd be that's my question. So Jamil Smith goes on to assert that Black Panther is about more than entertainment. It is about representation and what it means to be Black in both America and Africa. And a writer also, Mohale Mashigo, argues in her article that Black Panther's framework of Afrofuturism is not for Africans living in Africa. Mashigo believes Africans living in Africa need something entirely different, which goes again to this conversation of Black studies, either framed in, or the difference between Black studies and, I would argue, the other conversation about Pan-Africanism. And I take Mashigo to mean that centering the conversation on loss. So some people would say that if it's a deficit model, that would be it. So in wrapping this up, T'Challa, Killmonger, I think you all know those two characters. They represent two different versions of our Blackness, ancestral space, tribal markings, and I'll make this quick. If you look at the bodies, Killmonger's body is marked with his kills he's made, and I think stands in a great contrast to the other African markings that we see. So how are we to read bodies, the marking of the body, the portrayal of strong Black women? I think the idea of geographies come into play. Oakland, California versus Wakanda, Africa, the academy and the community think about responsibilities, the basketball court and the projects and the royal palace, the afterlife, where there's a scene where when he goes back to his father, Killmonger has to go back to the projects, and T'Challa actually goes to the afterlife where the ancestors are. There's the herb garden and the throne, the ocean slave ship and Africa and the projects, and then there's the legacies, and we can talk about that later. But there's a wonderful scene where Shuri talks about Agent Ross said, "Don't talk to me, don't scare me, colonizer," where they actually use that term in the film. So in conclusion, in imagining a new Black studies, one that fully embraces the tensions in our communities between Africans and Americanized Africans, the disciplinary concerns of representations of Blackness from multiple cultural lens and social positionalities, Black Panther ends where it begins, in the community. But instead of being an observer, as Njogu was sent to do in the projects of Oakland in the 1980s and 90s, T'Challa becomes an investor in his community, buying 3 buildings to provide access for those in the community to education and resources by establishing the Wakanda International Outreach Center, where Queen Nakia would do social outreach and Shuri would be responsible for the science and information exchange. Perhaps Black Panther is asking us as the viewer, what are we willing to invest in our communities? Not investing in them, not building ladders of access, and I mean ladders with rungs in them, will cost humankind in the long run as we neglect to utilize the gifts and talents of our global citizenry. As King T'Challa states at the end of the film, in times of crises, wise men, and I would not have said men, but wise people build bridges while the foolish build barriers. His statement begs the question and begs us to ask this question as practitioners of Black and Africana Studies. Are we merely observers or are we investors? Thank you.
So let's give our panelists a round of applause. So we're gonna open the floor for questions.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
Does anyone have a question? Yes, in the back.
Okay, so forgive me, I actually have 3 questions, but I wrote them down. Okay, so the first question is how do we actually define revolutionary? So how do you all define that? And then I have a lot of thoughts and opinions on Black Panther. I won't share them. But I feel like there's I think politically the film is kind of like we're talking to, it's kind of like a pork chop again Africanism versus like a Black liberalism. And I thought that was like a political takeaway from the film. So I thought it was a good movie, but I'm not convinced that it was actually revolutionary. And then to the point about Spike Lee, it's just interesting to me that he, out of all the movies he could have won an Oscar for, it's one for a Black person being a police officer, and what does that mean in the wake and in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement? Then the final question I had is a big one. With all this talk around Pan-Africanism, I would like to hear y'all's thoughts on this current discussion on African descendants of slaves, the way that they're approaching their argument.
We're just laughing because that conversation came up last night. I did so. Or today. Oh, it's today? Oh, yeah.
So you start with that one.
With the question?
Well,
yeah.
Well, one, there's a lot I'd like to say in response to all of your questions. And if I could just quickly, this is where I find myself in most disagreement around pop culture and pop representation of Blackness. So I'll just say again, a shameless plug for my website, imixwhatilike.org. We have a deep engagement with these films in a variety of ways with a variety of scholars. In terms of Black Panther, my good friend and comrade, Dr. Todd Burrows, published a book on the history of the comic, which is extremely important because the film takes a very conservative, the most actually conservative version of the Black Panther comic and puts it on the screen. The more radical versions, the characters had a history of various iterations written by both Black and white artists. And the most conservative version ended up in the film. And in fact, our first iteration of a project we started called Academics in Cars, which is driving around with academics talking trash, you know.
Behind you.
Oh, thank you. Right, thanks. The first one we did was with 2 of my friends as we left that film. And 2 quick points I want to make about that. One, I've developed sort of a semi-ironic compilation of old existing media criticism that I call the Vernon philosophy of Black media avoidance. And it's born out of an old friend of mine named Vern, who I worked with when we delivered pizzas. And he at one time, 20, 30 years ago, said, I'm never going to see another movie with Black people in it because we always end up looking bad. And initially I disagreed with him. Long story short, I now fully agree. And I think that our political approach to all commercial product, all commercial media product that claims to be a representation of any of what we all think we are should be rejected. We shouldn't see it. We should not look for, or at best, or if we see it at all, we shouldn't look for anything of value in it. We should see it for what it is, a product, a commercial product, in this case, a Disney product meant to disassociate people from the histories of radical traditions and politics. That's why in the film, Killmonger, who to me is the hero, has to be killed so that the preferred protagonist can do what he does in direct opposition to the real life Patrice Lumumba. And this is just one point I'm making, then I'll move on. That in real life, Patrice Lumumba, when he became the elected leader of the Congo, gave his speech looking almost exactly like what we saw at the end of Black Panther when he goes to speak before the EU or whatever that is. But when Lumumba went there, he said, we're nationalizing our resources, we're kicking the colonizers out, and we're using the wealth of our country as a pan-African revolution for Africans all over the world. He's assassinated. In this film, T'Challa comes and says, we're going to turn over all of our wealth to the CIA, and yes, they called him a colonizer, but then they give him all of the wealth and go after killing the revolutionary. And then what we end up seeing is they come down, as a friend of mine, they point out in the film, a Bugatti spaceship, and offer a nonprofit answer to the problems of the hood. This is exactly what Nixon did by replacing revolutionary organizations with nonprofits. So to me, the film is a huge problem. Quickly on ADOS, we have a lot of this, unfortunately, on our website as well. And my short answer here, because I don't want to monopolize all the time, is that this new movement, and I have my own personal history with these folks, is that it's a conservative rebranding of the reparations movement. And it's conservative in that the first thing they did was attack Pan-Africanism, attack black radical traditions, and look to isolate themselves, cut themselves off from other existing reparations movements, like in COBRA, which, for instance, called for freedom of all our political prisoners. They get rid of all of that analysis and literally wrap themselves in the American flag, literally put on MAGA hats, and say, essentially, we are Americans, and as Americans not associated with the anti-colonial struggles of anybody in the African diaspora or Latin America or anybody else, we want to come almost hat in hand to the state and beg for reparations. And even though some of their platform is collective and it's dealing, and institutional, it's dealing with the problems of black people, all they've done is rebrand what others have already done, minus the radical critical analysis and the international approach, which said we can't just go to the state that's creating all the problems and ask for a solution. We have to marshal all of our people from around the world with similar situations to put pressure on the state as a method or tactic of dealing with what we're doing here. So they get rid of Du Bois and Robeson and Malcolm and all these internet, Kwame Ture, and all these, and they say we're not dealing with any of that tradition. We're not going to deal with any of that. We're going to go straight. And then lastly, they even claim HR 40, that we should support HR 40, and deny that N'COBRA and others were instrumental in developing that bill. So I mean, I think it's a huge problem.
So the HR 40 is the Commission on Reparations.
It's just a call for a study. I mean, it's not even. Anyway.
Any other questions?
Or a chance, because we also have the definition of revolutionary. I don't know if you all want to.
Well, that's the only one that I pick up on, because I don't see the point in repeating what you said just in different language, because I agree with everything that you're saying. The thing with revolution is a willingness to overthrow as necessary and not to negotiate, because the negotiation is always a reinscription in some ways. And I don't say that lightly at all, because one of the things, I thought about it and said it similarly, the way that Toni K. Bombard describes her job as a writer, when she says, my job as a writer is to make revolution irresistible.
That's right.
There is that kind of impulse there, but the flip of it is, having a conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates at Howard once, of course he went to Howard for some time, and his dad was in the Panthers, and he's like, y'all gotta understand, revolution means death. So I don't want to exclude that as well. I want you to be clear. Part of what I want to do as a teacher is to make revolution irresistible, to say I'm not negotiating around certain kinds of things, because they become these reinscriptions. And that's part of the point that I was trying to make with the Clyde Taylor as well. You got to break the contract. It can't be negotiated. If we're talking about aesthetic valuing, when he walks us through from the beginning of aesthetics as a Western orientation that privileges whiteness over anything else, you can't negotiate that. You can't say, I'm going to make it to be, I'm going to morph it to be what it is that I want it to be. So revolution for me is a willingness to forego that which is comfortable, that which is standard, that which is clearly something that we need to depart from radically, and to create a new vision based on a different value system. And you don't even have to do it from scratch. which is why I was trying to suggest with the language issue as a serious part of the conversation that we have to have with African American studies. If African peoples are going to talk to each other on their own terms in their own languages without an interpreter and without a gaze, you got to be able to walk from the earliest of civilizations all the way through to be able to have these kinds of conversations, so that you don't have to create a thing anew. You can just look to the thing that was, because now you can recognize it. So, you know.
And just the response to, because my paper was really about the questions of representations of blackness and what's the difference between the study of blackness and black studies. And I think the two are conflated. I think this idea of revolutionary is an interesting one, particularly as in framing Coogler's work at a moment when Spike Lee gets an award and he's seen as revolutionary in his previous films that he's done, but he gets it for screenplay adaptation for Black Klansman, which, you know, in talking to some other folks, they've had problems with Black Klansman. What does it mean? How is this working? And so revolution, yes, bucking the system, but I think there's spectrums. The reason I said that the Black Panther, the film, had the same kind of impact that Barack Obama's election did. Is it really about black people, or is it about what white people process as blackness? And I think when we do the work of Black studies, it always is in dialogue with that, which is why I mentioned Toni Morris's notion of playing in the dark and this Africanism that's created. So is Coogler doing revolutionary work, or is he part of that dialogue? And I think that's a question that will be asked, because whether we think it is or it's not, it is part of American history and lore. It is part of that lineage. People will point back to it. They will, and of course I heard African folks say the dialects were bad, and so the authenticity of the film, I've heard that Black Panther, the existence of it meant that black men had to be devalued in this film. Black Panther, I heard an author write about that. And so I think it'll be interesting to find out how, when the second one comes out, or how Coogler continues to work, where would he be placed in the same vein as a Spike Lee? Or will he be seen as a more commercialized filmmaker? And, you know, what do we consider revolutionary film making? I think that's the other, because revolution in 2019 looks different than revolution in 1960.
But I mean, my concern though was also that, you know, because Spike Lee is also a commercial filmmaker. I mean, he's also someone who takes $200,000 to make pro-New York Police Department. You know, he historically was creating pro-military Navy commercials to get target black and brown people to go into the military. So I mean, there are many problems with his films. Yeah. I mean, I had, tremendous problem with his film Malcolm X. You know, it was a great acted film, but the politics are just, I think, totally.
Well, Hollywood's politics are.
So that would be my point, and that's exactly the point I want to get. The structure. So like I have a critique of Fruitvale Station. I have a critique of Creed, and to your point, Sylvester Stallone got the Oscar for that. And not Coogler, or Michael B. Jordan. But my concern, and I would love to hear anybody, that I'm hearing Coogler is making the film on Fred Hampton now.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And actually, two friends of mine are involved in that project, and I've discussed this with them, and I disagree with them. I don't want Fred Hampton to be in film. I don't want to see a state version or a Hollywood version of Fred Hampton, because I don't agree that it leads us to study them and then we learn them and then we become them. I think it works the exact opposite. So I really worry about all that. Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
No doubt.
Other questions? Dr. Jackson?
Not so much a question, it's just a comment when we're thinking about, movies, and in particular Spike Lee. It was interesting because after the Oscars, he's quoted as saying that I've been snake bit, right? Every time somebody's driving, somebody I lose, right?
Oh, wow.
He was vehemently, he was very upset afterwards with the loss, but, driving Miss Daisy, and now Green Book, the reverse. universal roles. And it's interesting because this is also someone who, as radical as we may perceive him to be, he's still kind of in the system. And I think that's very telling, so that as long as you are playing right within the system, you're a part of your environment, like the fish in the water, you can't really escape the politics of Hollywood or any other, organization that you're dependent on, right, to get your product out. So that's just something that came to mind as everyone in the panel was speaking. But I do want to throw out another filmmaker who seems to be making a lot of waves, and is Jordan Peele.
Yeah.
With Get Out, and with his newest
Us.
Is what is it?
Us.
Us, right.
Doppelganger.
I call it.
That's why I keep calling it doppelganger.
Yes, still commercial, right?
Yes.
Still some challenges, but I think that he's pushing the envelope. And keep in mind his production company, Monkey Paw, which I think is has some play on a lot of things going on here. But just how he creates these black protagonists, right, and who survive, racism as well as a host of other things. I just want to get your thoughts on perhaps his work and how he fits in the conversation of others like Jordan Peele, and not to on this subject, but I'm just curious.
Well, I'm curious. It's interesting. Of course, I liked Jordan Peele's Get Out. I did. I think, when I think of film and the provocative conversations, the fact that we're talking about it, I think, and the ways in which he engages in a public conversation about whiteness for real. I mean, when I say for real, you have a white woman protagonist who sets up brothers and is shopping for them online. I mean, the fact that you can put that in a film where the co-opting of bodies. And so one thing, it's interesting you say that, because I often feel those authors and directors are in a system just as we are as professors and administrators. And so while we want to be revolutionary, those revolutionary wings get clipped depending on how revolutionary you are. And so I think, as we often have done in the past, Black people have been very innovative and creative in the ways in which they've tried to dismantle and challenge systems within systems. So I think there's a spectrum of that. I like Jordan Peele's work. I haven't seen Us, but I liked Get Out. I was just speaking to them on our way over here. I want to do a book on Black horror, and think about how does the genre of horror allow us to really talk about the horrific violence towards Black bodies in this country. When I think of Candyman, I'm dating myself, but Candyman, Skeleton Key, Get Out, there's a whole lineage of that. Bones, there's a whole conversation about where horror brings up gentrification, racism, Tales from the Hood, those vignettes, yes. And so, yes, they are, the word revolutionary may need to be in quotes. In conversation may be what it is instead of being revolutionary, but they are, in their limited critique, trying to say something about something. At least it's not Driving Miss Daisy.
Right.
At least it's not 12 years, and not to say Solomon Northup's film was not important, but Hollywood only rewards certain films. So 12 Years a Slave, Monsters Ball, Training Day, A Corrupt Cop. Denzel has done films from Stephen Biko to Malcolm X, and that's the one you give it to him for. So Hollywood gives their stamp where they want. So how do we, and then there's the independent filmmakers who kind of try to insert themselves, but they don't make the critical success that the other films. And so who's going to back them? I think so. The politics, the economy of material blackness is what I call it. What does blackness? If you have people watching films who have not had a Black Studies class, this is the conversation I'm trying to have. How are they viewing blackness? Does that look like what they think blackness is? The projects, Oakland, basketball courts, geography, what are the primers for blackness that exist in popular culture that an entire generation is being raised on, cutting their teeth on, who do not have access. We forget that the academy is only available to 10% or a small amount of folks in the world. I mean, think about that. They only let the access, now my diversity work can tell you there's only certain folks that get in the academy. There are only certain folks that can afford it. So where do we have these conversations about authentic blackness or Africanism or Pan-Africanism? Where do those spaces happen? The Black church, community-based organizations don't function the way they used to in the 60s. And I think technology online is a space to have those conversations. Twitter, Instagram, which I'm not on any, so don't, I'm not on, no. LinkedIn is about as much as I'm doing with that. That's
The one exception that I think I wish we could talk about a little bit more, but I don't know that we'll ever, maybe 10, 15 years from now, is Nate Parker's Birth of a Nation.
Yeah.
That was as radical of a black film as I have seen. It got obscured by the rape crisis or the Me Too, pre-Me Too, but the rape allegations. But the work, even in terms of methodology that you see him doing in terms of how he's trying to present Nat Turner is really crucial and important. I mean, the influence and the way he represents mysticism, African spiritualities, revolution, a willingness to be very forthright.
And to die.
Yeah, it was a very surprising. I was surprised. I was curious whether there was going to be a shift from the film as it appeared at Sundance and the way that it ended up on the screen. I didn't think that it would make that Hollywood would allow it to happen, and
it took them 10 years, I think, to get funded or something.
But it was a really, I think, as radical as we're going to see with black filmmaking, but we still couldn't even get at it in terms of its content and the work that it was doing. It was completely obscured, not to suggest that it should not have been. I wish we could take him out of it and put another person into, so that we could really think about. That to me was as a critical moment in black cinematic history as something like Sankofa, and I would even argue, and
Daughters of the Dust.
I think it did more work than Daughters of the Dust did.
So that, and just to add, I'm just going to add to that, because I think one thing I want to add to that is that Nate Parker said that he was moved in an Introduction to African American Studies course to do Nat Turner's movie. So he actually connects the dots back to Black Studies to do that film. That's just something I know had come up in that. And the other thing is us. So even though the film is made, when you think of who African American audience will go see, they're not trying to go see A Birth of the Nation. Yeah, it didn't make it wasn't as critically successful when I think of attendance and box office.
Critically, but not box office.
Box office made that.
But I think connected to the controversy, but also we have to, and I don't remember. It's too long since I looked, but there was an issue with how many theaters it opened up in and what was the promotional budget. That's also a little secret.
That's right.
Last year, Robert Townsend released a documentary. The great black filmmaker Robert Townsend released a documentary that showed up in theaters for like a hot second. That was about the making of his film, The Five Heartbeats. And I would really encourage anybody to get a chance to see it, because it's really not about the Five Heartbeats. What I would argue it's really about the process of trying to make black film in Hollywood. Because the product that we end up seeing, which is still one of my favorite films of all time, had nothing to do with, well, no, I shouldn't say that, was very different from the original that he was trying to make, from the cast to the focus to the content. So when I'm critical of these films, it's never to be, or art or anything, it's never to be focused on the artist, him or herself. It's about the context in which all this is happening. So when I saw A Birth of a Nation, my problem with that film, just two examples. One, there's like 2 hours or 90 minutes of just abject, highly detailed violence subjected by black women and men. For the final 3 minutes of the revolt In other words, you see so much, in a film about Nat Turner, there's so much more black suffering and violent suffering for black people, and we get very little of the revolutionary moment that at least some of us were excited to see. And, so very few white people die on camera. There's very little white bloodshed involved. And then finally, the film does a very slick little thing. At the end, and if there's a spoiler, so be it, in the end of the film, they show, first of all, it's not historically accurate on so many different levels, but there's a piece about the film where the violence of Nat Turner's rebellion is somehow condemned until the little boy who's at the end of the film who avoids the rebellion is recast as a Union Army soldier with the American flag. And I was like, damn, look what they even try to co-opt Nat Turner and make it about an American experience. No, this was a revolutionary moment. And then the only point the two things about Jordan Peele that I would want to raise very quickly are one, I think it's fascinating that to have the most, I think, honest commercial media discussion of race, you have to make it as a horror film. I mean, I think that says a lot. And then the other thing, as someone who is so-called mixed, I think I'm fascinated by him being mixed, marrying a white woman, making this film. And I was like, dang, I would pay anything to sit at his in-laws' house. Like, what does his white in-laws think as he's about to marry this woman with this film coming out? So I was like, and the beauty of the course was that it was a critique of white liberalism. Yes. It didn't put the racism in the South where everybody's easy. It's easy to be critical of that. It put it up in the New York liberals. I thought that was brilliant.
Yes, and so, and I juxtapose that against a film, say, like Django. Which, when I think of, what is, if you're going to talk about revolutionary, because white people do die in that one. I remember being in the film thinking, did he just shoot the mistress like on the way out the door? Did he really do that? And did he do it for finding his woman? So it was about this love story. But he is the only one, and what's the man's name?
DiCaprio?
Yeah, Quentin Tarantino. Thank you. I wonder if he's the only one that could have gotten it. Spike Lee couldn't have produced that film.
Well, no, and Spike Lee critiques him for his use of the word.
That's right.
Right?
Yes.
And nigger, and how, and the amount of, or
the use of the word. Yeah, because DiCaprio was in there. I didn't like him, but the person I didn't like was Samuel Jackson. I was trying to get up and find him. Yeah. I wanted to, yes, his character. Yes, Lord. Yes, he played well.
That film. Look at that. Look at the subtle nonsense of that film. Look at the beginning of that film where a white man has to give these enslaved Africans permission to kill that first white dude at the beginning of the movie. When by the 1850s, history is very clear. Black people were in so much rebellion, not as individuals trying to escape enslavement, as was the case in the initial experience where it was so brand new. But by the 1850s, it was a collective. We need to not just free me and my one wife, but all of us.
Yes, that's exactly.
And that element of the film the history is wiped away from the film.
But that's what I mean about Hollywood. We're having a conversation here today. Mm-hmm. The people that went to go see the film are not having this conversation. So I mean, I think media, I think technology has been the best gift to us to have the conversation, because even with Green Book, there were articles written about the inaccuracies in Green Book, even though it won. There was inaccuracy about the depiction of Dr. Shirley.
Who said himself, I don't want a movie made of my life.
Yes.
And Ali had to call the family and apologize that he had not heard from them that there was an issue with the film at all.
But again, that goes back to the materialism of blackness. Yeah. So that's different than black studies. And I think we have to really, blackness has always been economic. It has always had an economic edge to it, whatever that looks like, whether it's mapped on the black bodies who get sold, whether it's mapped on the black bodies who play basketball and bring in millions of dollars, who run down fields, who win golf tournaments, whatever that looks like. That blackness has a material, economic purpose in some spaces, even us in the academy.
Sure.
It has that material, so we can't accept that. We have to be comfortable. We have to be comfortable about that conversation, and then the tensions between Africans who play American people on film instead of America. That's another hornet's nest that's starting
And vice
to
versa.
evolve.
When what's the sister who's the singer who played Winnie Mandela?
Yes.
Jennifer Hudson played Winnie Mandela. There were a lot of continental Africans who I thought raised, legitimate concern, like how we have all these black actresses or African actresses in South Africa who can't get a role. But
And then Colombalina. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh,
Dr. Carter?
I know what
Yeah.
you're talking about.
Okay, I think this is the right point to ask this question, and I hope it comes out as a question, because I have put some notes here to control myself. Because so much of what your discussion is about is in film and the commodification of blackness and black people and black intellectuals inside of film. On some level is happening in the academy, because you're all in the academy. I want to raise this in the academy. And the question is, what's happening to Black Studies? What's happened to Black Studies? I think that, we know how it originated, right? Black folks in the academy from the community. And so the two communities got together and made the point that in the academy, demanding that the epistemological reality be represented in the curriculum. Yeah. So that was the struggle of the students and the articulation of it and banging the doors down. They didn't say, y'all come on in, right? They kicked their way in. That's a really crucial history that put their point was the framing and the construction of a knowledge production must show us as also producers of knowledge and not merely consumers. That has historically been the fight, and I think on some levels in that study we're losing it. And we're losing it because partly there's a kind of conformist mentality that has taken over. And Dr. Ball, when you talked about the Cornell example of moving the center, this is real.
Yeah.
So how does that happen and where does it come from? It happens because there's not enough objection, and there's not enough objection because there's a kind of intellectual hegemony that many in Black Studies, in the academic journals, in Black Studies have conformed to. And that is, we want to be part of something else. There are tons of Black Studies professors who are being paid in Black Studies who not just align themselves with other departments, but will tell you that's where they come from.
That's right.
That's a neo-colonial mentality that's rife in the field.
That's right.
And so I'm from sociology and Black Studies. I'm not Black Studies and sociology, or I'm not Black Studies who happen to be a sociologist. That's not how we represent ourselves. So that is a major part of the problem. Coming up in the reality of the Cornell Center.
Because there's another event going on after this.
Yeah, so I'm wrapping this up.
Okay.
So I started with my question, what's happening to Black Studies, and so I'm just making these points about that. Because the Cornell Center, for example, little objection, that department don't look at their own PhD. Right now, their PhD program, they do not look, and I am telling you this is a fact, unless it changes here. They don't look at students who are not from Ivy League schools. What kind of colonial mentality is that? What are we saying? And that's one example of what has happened in the field, what this problematic looks like. We are contributing to it.
I don't disagree with what you're saying. I think we were talking about this. This is funny. Like a lot of our conversation now is something that we talked about over lunch or something. We were walking from one place to the next, and I said because I did my graduate work at Howard. When I got my job at LSU, Angela Mitchell, who's at Georgetown, finished a couple of years ahead of me, and we both laughed repeatedly because nobody thought we would get a job because our PhDs were from Howard. And literally going to different spaces and people saying, oh, but her PhD is from Howard. For me, it was a political decision. I made it, and I was perfectly prepared to deal with the consequences. And I have to ask students repeatedly to be aware of what it is they're doing. And it was the easy thing for me. There were 8 people, literally 8 people working in African American literature in that department when I went. Wasn't going to happen anywhere else. Anywhere else. So, and I have been in conversations since then, and at the time from when I was at LSU, it's been on review panels everywhere else, where the first thing people look at is where a person has gone to school. So we do contribute to that, and we do have to make those adjustments because that reinscription is something that we have to push back against. So I was talking to a colleague about, where a book came out at a particular kind of press. Same thing when I was at LSU, they literally gave us a list. If it's not one of these top 10 presses, then you can keep your little book. But of course, that means that gatekeeping element is there as well. I do not miss any, as much as it pains me, as much as I work more than 14 hours a day, I don't say no to reviewing any book at a press, a manuscript, or I don't have that luxury. If I'm serious about what it is that I'm trying to push out and to make sure that the kind of work that we're interested in has some home, then you have to do the work. Otherwise, somebody else gets it and they say no because I don't agree with your characterization of this as quote unquote black modernism, and I don't see a separation between modernism and black modernism or something like that. So we have to be participatory to push back at every turn against that neo-colonialism, because it's possible to fight it. I will not concede the space, and I don't think that it's just because I'm at Howard. When I was at LSU, wouldn't concede the space. When somebody came in my office and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry you had to hear," I was like, no. You sat at the lynching and watched it. I don't have any conversation for you. Don't come to my office after the fact. You watch somebody do an all frontal full attack, and then you come after the fact quietly and say, "I'm sorry, don't pay that any attention. This person does this other." No, you watch it, you participate in it. So we have to create essentially people who are willing to be resistant at whatever cost. I've decided I will eat always. That's the only, I need somewhere to stay and I need some food. Beyond that, I don't need elitism. I don't need, and I can say that as a administrator who's somewhat class. Similarly, in the interim deanship that I am, I said I'm a faculty member first with the provost. He said, "I don't know how long you gonna last." I don't care. If I come in another meeting where y'all just really talking about faculty as the worst people in the world, what are y'all doing this for? The impulse has to be there to stand up for what we know is right, whatever the consequence.
Change the conversation, because that's the way I feel. When I come in the room, the conversation changes. It has to, and it has to because of the social capital you build on the campus. If you have no social capital in your account, when you come in a room and the conversation does not change, that should tell you what your account looks like.
It's a calling to accountability. Because buying into that intellectual hegemony is to be complicit in our own erasure.
What I've learned from the Africana Studies experience at Cornell is that one thing we always have to remember is it was the macrocosm of what we see happening on college campuses in the micro, where a group will be revolutionary, the administration will wait them out, they graduate, and then they just move on. The same thing happened with Africana. They just waited 50 years to start slowly deteriorating it from within as people get older, as salaries go up, as promises are made, as lies are told. And one of the reasons why I wanted to start doing that little academics and cars thing, just with some fun with some friends, is because I wanted to start to actually have people share stories of what it really is like to be in academia. There's so many myths and misunderstandings from those who are just starting or those who are never in the academy about what happens. What Dr. Williams is talking about here, as I hear it, are the sacrifices that many people have to make that no one ever hears about. So there were struggles at Africana. There were mighty struggles, maybe not strong enough, but there have been mighty struggles where there have been several who have suffered career-wise for it. Yeah. So a lot of times people just, little whisper campaigns start, little things that you can't overtly claim are happening just start happening, and people's careers start going left or disappearing entirely. So this is why I keep coming back to this adherence to the original mission of the field, and the radical ideas that are constantly being assaulted. So my version of what Dr. Williams does is every time I'm in a room, I'm constantly talking about Pan-Africanism, nationalism, socialism, communism, armed struggle, all these things that are components of radical struggles that are meant materially to be wiped out, and of course have their corollary in academia wiped out as well. And by the way, real quick, the quote I messed up was, "We don't know who discovered water, but we know it was not the fish." And all pervasive environment is always beyond perception. So I just had to get that in there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm just going to add just to talk about the struggle writ large. The numbers of people of color in the academy tells you where the struggle is. The fact that we're still having the conversation about access, the fact that numbers of diversity is still where they are, means that we will always, until that changes, until critical mass is created, we're going to always have this disconnect between community activism and power.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.